Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Wallach, and I'm proud to bring the Battle of the New York City Casinos to the Conduct Detrimental podcast. Anybody who knows, sort of my background, I'm into gaming and sports wagering, and we got a lot on the docket this week with the NFL owners meetings and Dan Snyder. But I've wanted for a long time to kind of zero in on the Olympics style bidding war to place 3 casinos in the New York City region. And joining me today on Conduct Detrimental is someone who's been described by the New York Post as politically wired with a deep understanding of the New York government as well as the political stakeholders in New York. And for me personally, this is somebody who's been at the sort of epicenter of the debate around daily fantasy sports, mobile sports wagering. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome Evan Stavisky, founder and president of the Parkside Group, to Conduct Detrimental. Evan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Nice to chat with you.
Yeah, you're a Queens guy?
Yeah, I grew up in Whitestone, Queens, which is just on the north shore of the borough, right between the Whitestone and Throgs Neck bridges.
Okay, I used to go to Adventurers Inn.
So I live Adventurers Inn. I knew it well. It's gone, obviously, for a long time, but for many years I had an apartment in Flushing, right on the other side of the expressway from Adventurers Inn. And if you go about 3 or 4 blocks from there, there's a school named for my late father, a street named for my late father, and a post office named for my late father, all within about a quarter mile of the old Adventurers Inn.
Yeah, your father was a New York State lawmaker, and your mother as well?
Yeah, my dad was in the Assembly and Senate for many years. And then when he passed away, my mother was elected to succeed him in 1999.
Okay, before we get to the your topic at hand, you actually ran into somebody wearing a Conduct Detrimental T-shirt on the campaign trail for your mom.
I did.
So, worlds colliding here.
Yeah, I was in Eastern Queens in a development called North Shore Towers right before Election Day last year, and one of the local customs in that neighborhood is you go from table to table in the restaurants in the development with some of the folks who live there to introduce the candidates. And I saw someone in a Conduct Detrimental shirt, and I said, you know what? We have a mutual friend. I know Daniel Wallach. And so there was the icebreaker for us to talk and get a pledge that he would vote for my mother.
Well, you got the show's endorsement as well. Did your mother win the re-election?
She did. She won in a landslide in a hotly contested, hard-fought race. But yeah, she did very well in a district that was only 2% of her previous district.
Okay, well, cause and effect. So if you want to
there
win
you go.
Queens County, you really have to come, hat in hand to Conduct Detrimental. So
exactly.
Tell us about some of the representative clients you've had in New York gaming. I know some of the fantasy sports companies, but the leagues and now casinos. Give the audience just a little bit of a flavor of your background in history.
Sure. So we've represented fantasy sports companies, as you mentioned. I started representing FanDuel and DraftKings back in 2015, shortly before the Attorney General brought litigation against them, and worked with the companies to advance a legislative solution that regulated fantasy sports in the state and allowed the companies to survive. Worked with them further on the mobile sports betting effort that included both direct lobbying, communications, TV commercials, grassroots engagement to help persuade legislators and the then governor to support mobile sports betting. We now represent the Sports Betting Alliance, which is a trade association that includes a number of companies in the space. And outside of that, we've worked for Las Vegas Sands. I've worked for the previous owners of one of the existing upstate New York commercial casinos, and I'm probably forgetting something.
All right. Well, I remember that legislative session in 2016 when the Daily Fantasy Sports or the Interactive Fantasy Contest Act passed. That was a hearing that went until 2, 3 in the morning, and I think you're right. The fate or the whole trajectory of DraftKings and FanDuel might have been somewhat different had that legislation not passed 7 years ago. Of course, it was challenged in the courts, but that was a pivotal point in sort of the expansion of, I guess, I guess it's not gambling, but the expansion or the sort of the gateway to sports wagering in New York City, in New York State?
Certainly the company's had hundreds of thousands of engaged customers, and that was the most important thing that helped the legislature understand that there are people who want to be able to play daily fantasy sports, and they're going to be really angry if someone tries to take that ability away from them. But yeah, the companies were obviously hugely engaged. We had seen leadership from both companies in Albany on a pretty regular basis. Obviously, the great lawyers over at Wallach, led by Jeremy Kudon, run the national effort on behalf of the companies. But the New York law wouldn't have been even a possibility if it wasn't for Jeremy's work. So there's a lot of people who are engaged in it. There's other lobbying firms in New York who work with us, as well as some of my colleagues at Parkside. But it was a great victory, and it was certainly a hard-fought, tough thing to win, because at the last minute, some of the existing racetracks and commercial casinos all came out trying to stop the bill from passing. But as you said, it passed at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in time-honored Albany tradition on the last day of session, and it was a good win. And with that victory and the future of the two largest operators in the space, FanDuel and DraftKings, assured that they could continue to operate in New York, it certainly made us well positioned to be able to make the case for mobile sports wagering and honestly begin to identify the issue for state policymakers even before there was a decision in the NCAA versus Murphy case. So there was a belief that the Supreme Court was going to act, and we began to educate policymakers even ahead of the court's action, just to put it on their radar screen and begin the conversations.
Well, I hope you celebrated that legislative victory with a nice dinner at Jack's Oyster House. One of my old
so Jack's has been closed for about 4 or 5 months. Its fate is uncertain. There's a story in the Albany Times-Union today, but the victory on fantasy sports we celebrated at a place called the Hill Street Pub at the middle of the night, where I ran into other people who wrapped their last issues at the end of session, and a couple of reporters here or there, including somebody from the New York Times, who became their Albany bureau chief, and told me it was the first time that he had a sports byline in the Times.
Well, let's transition into something that also shares hard fought, engaged, base, the battle, or at least the licensing of 3 downstate New York casinos. As I look around the country, I notice that some of the largest cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, well, recently Chicago is, going to have a casino, but some of the major metropolitan centers, especially the largest city in the United States, doesn't have any casinos. Why has it taken so long for New York State to get around to licensing or choosing locations for either, Queens, Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, or Long Island, when the casinos were constitutionally authorized about 10 years ago? Why is it taking so long?
So it was, your timing is right. It is 10 years ago. It was 2013 that the voters gave final approval to a constitutional amendment. I mean, New York has a long-standing constitutional prohibition on gambling. And there are specific exceptions that are carved out, such as the lottery, and in 2013, such as casinos, up to 7 casinos. The enabling legislation that went along with the constitutional amendment specified that for the first several years, only upstate would be allowed to have casinos. And you have to remember, casinos were advanced, and we did some of the early polling for the advocates in favor of authorizing casinos back in 2013. It was a policy of the previous governor to try to create jobs in upstate New York. Upstate New York has a lot of towns that have been tough times. You've got aging steel towns. You've got towns that boomed during the Erie Canal, but have had more challenging times since. You've got cities like Rochester, where digital imaging really did a number on Kodak and Xerox. So this was an opportunity to try to create destination resorts in upstate New York. And the legislature, in advancing the constitutional amendment, put some guardrails around it, as they're authorized to do, to say the first few casinos are going to be in upstate. We're going to look to try to create good, sustainable jobs in these communities. So that happened. 4 casinos were eventually authorized. Originally only 3, but it became 4. One, and you know the geography of the state, but for everybody who doesn't, New York's actually a pretty big state by Northeast standards. So the closest casino to New York City is about 100 miles northwest of the city in the Catskills and the old Borscht Belt, vaudeville towns. There's one along the southern tier in the Pennsylvania border near Binghamton or Scranton, Pennsylvania. There's one between Syracuse and Rochester, south of Lake Ontario, and the closest one to a population center is there's one in the city of Schenectady, which is a small city about a half hour west of Albany. So those casinos have been up and running. Obviously, they've had some challenges with the pandemic. They've had some challenges getting the tax rate on their slots somewhat more equitable. But those casinos have been up and running, and now it's an opportunity to try to bring them downstate. And there's a lot of great opportunities to build downstate, but there's also some very complicated politics around the approval process for downstate casinos.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, one of the attributes of this licensing process is it has so many similarities to countries like bidding for, the Summer Olympics. You have all these, high profile, bidders, and it's a beauty contest. We have sort of the convergence of commercial casinos, tribal casinos, major real estate developers. Steve Cohen and the New York Mets, Las Vegas Sands is involved in this. It is really a sort of, I wouldn't say a hodgepodge, but it's not the usual cast of characters or stakeholders that are bidding on something like this. Normally we would expect, gaming operators, but these are some very sexy bids. So what is so attractive as we head into a digital world where, online sports betting is so important and 80% or more of the wagers are made online, iGaming is supposed to be like the next big thing. Why do we care so much about the siting of a bricks and mortar casino? Why is this really galvanized some of the biggest, stakeholders in real estate, gaming, and sports?
Well, so first of all, New York is a very big gaming state. Gaming is very popular. In addition to our 4 commercial casinos, we have multiple tribal casinos, all in various parts of upstate New York. Mobile sports betting has been hugely successful. The state took in $900 million in taxes in its first year. Obviously, there's some challenges about making that sustainable for the long term, but there's definitely interest. We believe iGaming is going to advance within the next couple of years in New York. We're hopeful to try to get it done this year, but we have some more work to do. But you have to remember, New York's also one of the biggest tourist destinations in the country, if not the world. So you have an opportunity to create destination casinos at a place where tourists are already traveling to. But as Sinatra said, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That doesn't mean that you can make it in New York. In order to make it in New York, it's going to take a lot of money. The bids require $500 million minimum in fee, $500 million in mandated capital improvements. So you have to be able to chalk up at least $1 billion to the effort. It requires local engagement and approval. We have a very unique process that was written into the law that says after the question period is over and you can submit your applications, they can't be evaluated until a community advisory panel made up of local elected officials from the affected town, or in the case of New York City, neighborhood, are able to have their appointees weigh in. And then obviously you have to ensure that they're going to be good union jobs. New York's a very big union state. And putting that all together is complicated and tough, and it requires sort of the best of the best to be able to compete and to have a shot. But really the rubber's going to hit the road on some of these approval processes. Some of the locations that have been proposed are on public parks. That requires, under the public lands doctrines in New York and under common law, that you have to have an alienation of parkland. So in order for a park to be used for a non-park purpose, the state legislature must authorize that specifically, and that's separate from the local approval process. You need to go through zoning, and zoning in New York is very complicated. So there's a lot of steps that are in the way, and it's not for the faint of heart. And what it means is, because the prospect is so, the prospective upside is so huge, there's a lot of interest, but it's really the cream is going to rise to the top to be able to make the best bids possible against the various challenges that they have.
Is this a play for iGaming and online sports betting as well? Because as we look ahead with future policymaking in New York State, I think it's commonly understood that iGaming is, online casino gaming is going to be next on the horizon as far as major legislative expansion around gambling in New York. And I would have to think the casinos, the 7 casinos, and in the New York Constitution, there's permission for up to 7 casinos. Those are going to be the operators both on the land as well as potential iGaming. So when you're doing the sort of the cost benefit analysis and projection of future revenues, this is also an iGaming play potentially for these casino companies.
Well, the iGaming legislation that's pending in New York envisions more skins than just the 7 commercial operators. It would include other stakeholders such as certain racetracks. The tribal nations would have the opportunity to opt in, mobile sports wagering operators who are directly licensed by the state. So look, I think the bigger thing to understand is that iGaming is accretive to land-based casinos. So many of your existing commercial casinos are far from the population center. iGaming is an opportunity to get and retain customers throughout the state. And the same holds true for the operators who might win one of the 3 downstate licenses. They'll have the opportunity to engage in iGaming. Hopefully, they'll have the opportunity to engage with customers when they're not on the property, and they'll have opportunity to engage with customers who may not be in their part of the state. If you win a casino in New York, well, in New York City, the second largest city in the state is Buffalo, and that's 500 miles away. So there's no reason that the land-based operators aren't able to have additional good union iGaming jobs in the state and serve the entire state, even if they're physically located in New York City.
Okay, let's before we get to the contenders, let's focus on the process.
Sure.
The New York Constitution created this sort of authority to pursue casinos, and the New York legislature created a complicated process that involves the creation of a New York State Gaming Facility Location Board. There's a role for the New York State Gaming Commission, as well as something you alluded to earlier, a Community Advisory Committee. What comes first in the process? I'm looking on a regular basis for some activity. I go to the New York State Gaming Commission's website. I go to the Gaming Facility Location Board's website. There's just been nothing but crickets since the beginning of January. Let's talk about the process. How is it going to work in terms of the next step in New York and ultimately leading to the timing? Because it doesn't look like 2023 is within the horizon for a decision on the 3 downstate casinos. We're already almost in April, and I just haven't seen that much activity. So how is this going to work? Who makes the decisions, and what are the critical phases of this timeline?
Sure. So we're in the first phase. The commission, the Gaming Commission, which is made up of appointees by the governor and the legislature, but primarily by the governor, issued an RFA. And the RFA allows people to ask questions. The commission received several hundred questions from interested parties. And then there's going to be, once those questions are answered, there's going to be a second round of questions, because you answer the question, you create new questions. At the end of that second round of questions, once there's sort of a general understanding of where things go, applicants will be able to submit applications to the Gaming Facilities Licensing Board. So that's a 3-person, the Casino Siting Board. It's a 3-person commission or board. It's made up of the president of the Greater New York Women's Chamber of Commerce, the former New York City Housing Commissioner, and the president of Hofstra University.
My Civ,
They'll
Evan, he's my Civ Pro professor. I took
there you go.
the last course in civil procedure offered by Professor Stuart Rabinowitz, Hofstra Law School, 1988, 89, out of a class of 100. I'll toot my own horn here. I got the only A+ in the class. And he was so scarred by the experience that he left academia and he became the dean of the law school and eventually the president of Hofstra University. And now he's back in private practice of counsel to Meltzer Lippy in Long Island. And now he serves on this facility, this gaming facility location board. How important in terms of making the decisions, how important are these three people?
They're going to make the decision. And I want to get back to the community advisory committee, because that's really one of the choke points that I think people outside New York may not understand the nuance there. But the gaming facility board, the 3-person committee, they're going to pick the applicants. Eventually, the commission has to issue licenses, but the commission's not an appeals process. If you're not awarded by the licensing board, you're not going to be able to go over their head to the gaming commission. So those 3 people are going to make the decision on the three downstate licenses. We talked about New York City, but it's really the whole downstate region. It's New York City, it's Long Island, it's the Lower Hudson Valley. But before you can get to that committee, when you file an application, the first thing that happens is there's a community advisory committee that's set up to review the application. And if you don't pass the community advisory committee with a 2/3 vote, you're out of luck. So in New York City, it's a 6-person committee. And again, it's different members based on the location, but there's an appointee of the governor. There's an appointee of the mayor. There's an appointee of the state senator who represents the location that's proposed. There's an appointee of the assembly member who represents the location that's proposed. There's an appointee of the borough president and an appointee of the local city council member. Outside the city, there's only 5 members. And again, still requires 2/3. So you need 4 out of 5 instead of 4 out of 6. Mm-hmm. It's an appointee of the governor, an appointee of the county executive. Again, the 2 state legislators have appointees. And then the locality, so if it's within a city, so if it's Yonkers, for example, it would be the mayor of Yonkers has an appointment. If it's in a town but not a village, it's the town supervisor. And if it's in a village, it's somebody jointly picked by the town supervisor and the village mayor. So these committees are going to be a choke point for a lot of applications. In particular, there's a lot of focus on Manhattan. And the problem is the community advisory committee language was put in at the request of some very influential state lawmakers from Manhattan who are against citing casinos in Manhattan. So you certainly have some very significant challenges for some of the Manhattan sites as a result of that. And if you can get the local state senator, local assembly member, and local city council member to all be against, the thing can't go forward. It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars or what big name is associated with it. It's a scenario where the local council member, assembly member, and senator their appointees can block something from moving forward. Well, now, there's also, as I said earlier, some of these proposals are on New York City or on parkland in general, and to alienate or remove parkland from public use requires a separate law to be passed by the state legislature. And that's another opportunity for the entire legislature to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to do that.
Can I ask you about the parklands issue?
Sure, yeah.
That really raises the specter of New York Mets owner Steve Cohen. And we're talking about one piece of land in particular here, I believe.
There's 2.
Oh, there's 2.
There's also one that's a proposal for the Trump golf course in the Bronx, right over the Whitestone Bridge.
Okay, so Steve Cohen's vision for a casino complex involves building a casino on the CitiField, near a parking lot near CitiField that happens to be on property designated as parkland. Is that correct?
So yeah, again, there's 2 locations that I'm aware of that are in parkland. One is, I think it's Bally's is looking at the golf course that's in a city park next to the Whitestone Bridge.
The Trump golf course?
The Trump golf course.
In New York City?
It would get Trump's name off of the course, which is something that I think most people would like. I don't know if people would want a casino there. That's a whole separate conversation. But certainly, Trump's not, New Yorkers know Donald Trump the best, and he's probably less popular here than everywhere. And you can decide whether or not there's correlation or causation there.
Well, that goes back a long time. That goes back a long time.
Goes back generation.
I went to the first ESPY Awards in 1992, and he was dating Marla Maples at the time. I'd have even been married to Marla Maples. Dennis Miller was the host of the first ESPYs, and I was a seat filler. And this was when it was on commercial. I guess it was being recorded for future airing, or might have been live. And he told everybody, "Okay, everybody, boo them." And they got a little bit of a Bronx cheer, which is, kind of maybe not purely a coincidence, because now Bally's and another group want to build a casino on a former Trump golf course in the Bronx.
But it's still the Trump golf course. He still has a license from the Parks Department. They tried to kick him out, but it's been enmeshed in it. Look, it's just too many legal fights involving Trump to keep track of. But that's certainly one of them.
Well, it sounds like to me. What happens? Okay, we're in the legislative session in New York. The session ends at some point in June. Does Steve Cohen, does this parkland designation have to be passed by state legislative statute before the end of this legislative session? Otherwise, they're out?
Yeah, there is a bill pending, introduced in the Assembly. I'm not sure that it's got a companion in the Senate, which is a necessary step, that would allow for alienation of the parkland at CitiField. And again, the Court of Appeals, which is New York's highest court, actually had a decision on these parking lots a couple of years ago. So CitiField is built in a New York City park. It's built in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. If you ever read The Great Gatsby and they talk about the ash heaps of Flushing Meadows, that's the park. And it became a park following the World's Fair in 1932, and then again in 1964.
I was at that
CitiField.
one. I was at that one.
You got me beat. I wasn't around yet. But I missed it by a couple of years. But the stadium was built in the park. It required alienation of the parkland, and any further use requires alienation of the parkland. So even though it's a parking lot, it's accessory to the stadium, and the stadium is a park purpose. So using it for anything other than a park purpose requires alienation by the legislature. In order for the legislature to consider the bill, something else has to happen, which is parkland alienation traditionally requires a home rule message in each house. So here's what has to happen. This is going to get a little complicated for a second.
Well, this is a law podcast, Evan, so it's like right in our wheelhouse. Don't worry about it.
And I'm not even a lawyer, but humor me. So the New York City Council is going to have to pass a resolution requesting the legislature to pass this bill. And that must then happen, assuming the approval process is going to be sometime before next year. That bill would have to go through the New York City Council, the New York State Assembly, and the New York State Senate, and be signed by the governor prior to June 8th, or that site will not have site control. They will not have access to the site. And one of the requirements is you have to have appropriate local zoning, and parks can't be zoned. So again, without that bill, there's very significant problems for the two, and I'm sorry, without either of those bills, there would also have to be a bill in for the Bronx site. Without either of those bills, those sites would have very specific and very difficult problems. And look, there's certainly community opposition to losing parkland. How that's impacts the local elected officials. I can't speak to that yet. It's a developing situation.
Okay.
But certainly those are some challenges beyond the community advisory committee process. But you get through the community advisory committee process, you go to the licensing board, then eventually to the gaming commission, or selection board, then to the gaming commission.
Okay, well, let's talk about the sort of the local or the community advisory committee process. I mean, I lived through, as a sports fan, I lived through the boondoggle of trying to build a new Jet stadium on the west side of Manhattan. How on earth, with the traffic the way it is throughout Times Square, the east side of Manhattan, how is a proposed New York City casino at the United Nations, a Monte Carlo style casino on the top floor of Saks Fifth Avenue, it's going to make buying suits, hellish. I mean, Saks Fifth Avenue, for those who aren't New York City natives or New York City, wise, Saks Fifth Avenue is located adjacent to St. Patrick's Cathedral in probably the most heavily trafficked part of New York City. To get through the Midtown Tunnel, to get all the way to the West Side, you want to avoid Fifth Avenue in the 40s at all costs. This is a quagmire, regardless of whether we're talking about Times Square, Fifth Avenue and 48th, or the East Side near the United Nations. How difficult is it going to be, or how likely will it be for these projects? And we're talking about the SL Green Caesars project at Times Square, the Hudson Bay project at Hudson Yards and Wynn joint venture, west side of Manhattan. And I don't know who the Saks Fifth Avenue bidder is. And then there's the United Nations that is, I don't know, maybe it's a tribe.
It's a little below the United Nations. It's the vacant site in the high 30s, right off of the FDR Drive.
Okay, how challenging will this be for those three or four Manhattan casino proposed projects?
Look, they've got problems. Liz Kruger is a state senator. She's one of the most influential people in Albany. She chairs the Senate Finance Committee. She represents Midtown and the East Side. And when people met with her, she said in Politico, I'm not even sure why they're wasting their time talking to me, because I'm pretty against. And so you may have similar positions from some of the city council members, state senators, state assembly members representing Manhattan. I think you have some very significant challenges on the Manhattan sites that some folks aren't necessarily considering. It's fundamentally about local politics. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but they've got some very significant challenges for all the reasons you mentioned. The Saks Fifth Avenue site is across the street from St. Pat's. It's a block away from Rockefeller Center. It's already congested. Parts of Fifth Avenue obviously have Secret Service presence because of Trump, because Trump Tower is only a few blocks away. So it's a very tough part of Manhattan, particularly in the late fall and approaching the holidays in December. Just becomes an absolute morass. So I think some of the elected officials are probably going to be skeptical as a result of that. Again, doesn't mean that they don't have a shot. Just means they got a big mountain to climb on some of the Manhattan locations. The same way that a Queens location probably has to overcome the fact that a lot of active local civic groups probably have concerns about losing parkland. That's not a reflection on the strength of the bid. It's simply there's people who object to losing parkland.
Okay. Let's look at the proposed sites that have a lower degree of difficulty. New York has these video lottery terminal facilities. I think there are like 11. I don't know what the total number is, but there are two in particular located within the, I guess, the New York City surrounding area. One is the MGM managed MGM Empire City at the old Yonkers Raceway. And then there's Resorts World New York City at the site of the Aqueduct Racetrack. They've been operating as casino style facilities for many years, generating revenues for I think the state lottery. They have slot machines or slot machine style, games. The conventional, I guess, wisdom and the handicapping that's being done by the sort of the gaming cognoscente and the politicos, that these two facilities have the upper hand because they're already, I mean, New York's the downstate New York City or the downstate New York licensing process is capped at 3 facilities. There are only going to be 3 winners. Do the 2 in Yonkers and at Aqueduct have the upper hand because they've already cleared community opposition by virtue of existing for the last number of years, and maybe they're favored because they're already producing jobs and they're generating revenues for the state of New York? Why are they the favorites? Why are they not the favorites? Take two sides of the same coin.
I'll try to unpack both of those. The strength that those 2 locations have is not just that they have local support, but that they've also got existing employees, they've got existing relationships. And so as a result, it's not about introducing something new. They also have certainly good highway access. Aqueduct is actually very close to Kennedy Airport. It also has rail, it has subway access not that far away. The Yonkers Raceway is right off the New York State Thruway, almost at the city line between the Yonkers and the Bronx. So they have already gotten support from local neighborhood, community, and elected officials because they've already been in operation and they're a known commodity. And it's not something new and different and scary. And they've actually, instead of having to overcome skepticism, they start out with the support of many people in that community advisory committee process. Again, I don't know specifically how anyone's going to vote. I'd have to double check the lines. But by and large, they have fewer headaches from the local elected officials than, say, some of the Manhattan sites might. The flip side, if I had to try to come up with one, would be they're already revenue producing and there are only 3 possibilities available in the state constitution, is that you could keep the VLTs and then also add some casinos. I guess it's not.
I've made that point. Evan, I've made that point. Would you rather have 5 or 3?
It's, look, I can't tell you, are they favorites or are they not? Because those are decisions that are going to get made by the 3-person committee. But that's presumably the way that they would weight that and look at that. And, they'd have to balance the fact that there's a lot of support and can be up and running faster versus the fact that maybe they could do more.
Okay. All right. Now let's look at some of the other contenders. I went to Hofstra Law School. I'm a Long Island, bred attorney in person. I lived in East Meadow, used to go to Islander Ranger games religiously at the Nassau Coliseum. And I've stayed at the Las Vegas, Sands hotels in Las Vegas, the Venetian, the Palazzo. Las Vegas Sands is making a play for a casino in Long Island. I believe it's the only proposed bidder for a Long Island casino. Can you tell me a little bit about that project and where it fits into the sort of the scheme of the different contenders? I'm not asking you to rank it, but what's different and what's unique about that proposal? We've heard about some of the others, tightly congested New York City, the supposed front runners in Queens and Yonkers. What is so special and or iconic about a Long Island casino?
So look, I'm not here to talk on behalf of Las Vegas Sands, but obviously worked with the company over the years. I think one of the things that you're going to see there is I believe there's local support from the town of Hempstead. So I think that's, a box that some of the other casinos may not have been able to check. It's also, as you say, probably the leading contender on Long Island. Long Island, for those of you who aren't from New York, means something different depending on whether you look at a map or whether you look at the lines of the city of New York. Technically, 2 New York City boroughs are on Long Island. But when we talk about Long Island, we're referring to Nassau and Suffolk counties that have almost 4 million people. It's got good proximity to transit. It's the Meadowbrook Parkway is right there. You've got decent connections to the airport. Certainly, that is a selling point there.
Jones Beach and Point Lookout.
There's tons of things on Long Island, and the hub, which was one of the development projects for the former Nassau Coliseum site, has been struggling, and so there's been a desire to redevelop the area, the Coliseum itself, which was unfortunately the scene of many great Islander victories. I say unfortunately as a Ranger fan, but more importantly, as I said to you earlier, I've been to at least one famous Grateful Dead show there when Branford Marsalis played with them in the spring of 1990. But other than that, it's been a few years since the Islanders have had a presence in the Coliseum. The Brooklyn Nets actually have their G League team playing at the Coliseum. The Nets are actually one of my clients, but they're very engaged in the local community through their G League team. But the future of the parcel has certainly been something that's stymied elected officials, both Republicans and Democrats, for a number of years, pretty much since the Islanders first moved to Brooklyn, and now they're obviously back in Nassau at Belmont. So that site is ripe for development, whether that's a casino or not. That site is ripe for development, and there's a desire to bring in the kind of property tax and sales tax revenue that a casino could generate. Because when you're talking about Nassau, you're also talking about some of the highest property taxes in America, and a lot of people who are really upset about that. And so being able to bring in a tax generating property to that site seems to have some good local support.
How is the acreage, at that site relative to some of the other proposals? In Manhattan, there were some smaller footprints. Long Island, you may have a little bit more space to work with. Give me a sort of a picture of how expansive the Las Vegas Sands site is relative to some of the other contenders.
Well, by definition, it's going to be more spread out and have a greater footprint than something in Manhattan, just because of the cost of Manhattan real estate. It's just prohibitive. In Manhattan, you would go up, not out. And the Coliseum, if for anyone who's never been there, is a 10, 15,000 seat arena that's heydays were probably in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, surrounded by massive fields of parking lots. So it's just a big, open, empty place with a old casino, with an old Coliseum in the middle of it. So certainly you have a footprint possibility there. I couldn't tell you the acreage. I couldn't tell you what the plan is, because again, I'm not here to talk on behalf of Sands.
All right, the Islanders have left. They're playing now in this brand new facility on the Queens Long Island border. Is the Nassau Coliseum going to remain part of this if the casino is awarded? Are there plans, at least at the present time, to do anything with the Nassau Coliseum beyond its current use, which I believe is limited to G League games, maybe some NCAA basketball games and concerts?
Look, I think the development of that site has been a priority for multiple county executives. I think it's a big open space that's owned by the county, and there's an opportunity to develop it, and that's got people interested because Charles Wang looked at trying to develop the property, other people looked at trying to develop the property, and the various plans just haven't come to fruition. So that's unfortunately something that Nassau has been struggling with.
Yeah. Okay, so we've sized up these various contenders. I think we've left a couple out. There are about 10. Are there going to be any surprise?
I mean, you've got a couple other sites that are out there. Look, I think any of the Manhattan sites have some challenges from local support from the Community Advisory Committee. It doesn't mean that they can't get approved, just means they've got some challenges. And I think that those are real. Obviously, you've got a couple sites on the parking lot, rather in the parks. There's a couple other sites that have been talked about, one down in Coney Island, which has the advantage of being a historic tourist destination. It's famous boardwalk. Doesn't have great road access. The Belt Parkway is kind of a hot mess much of the time, but there is some subway service there, although not an express train, and it's a long ride on the F. There's also a proposal for Staten Island at the St. George Ferry Terminal. Staten Island is another, for those who are not from New York, is another of the 5 boroughs of New York City. It's not connected to the city's mass transit network, and this would not be particularly close to the Verrazano Bridge, but there's literally a ferry terminal right there that takes people to Lower Manhattan. And if you ever travel to New York, it's one of the best free things you can do is ride the Staten Island ferry across the harbor around sunset. But so there's a few other outlying sites that have been talked about. Look, the whether or not they can get the support of the community advisory committees, I don't know. Whether or not they can make the financial and economic development case to the casino siting board, also, all of these things are question marks. But that tends to be the gist of it. Is there's there's the 2 existing VLT locations. There's the couple places we've talked about. There's the couple in the outer boroughs, and a handful of people with great dreams in Manhattan.
All right, as we sort of get closer to the end of this segment, when we get past this sort of contentious, I think the Community Advisory Committee you've pointed out is the choke point for so many of these bids. Are these going to be public hearings where the public can attend, and they're going to sort of be these emotionally charged public hearings, or are these conducted in closed room sessions?
I actually don't know the answer to that. In general, New York has a pretty good open meetings law that if a board is making a decision and you have a majority of its members present, it's usually subject to the open meetings law. I'd have to go back and look to see if there's a carve out to the open meetings law included. But the other thing is that while we have a pretty good open meetings law, we also have a long tradition of a lot of the stuff gets hashed out in private. And so it could very easily be a circumstance where a lot of stuff gets hashed out in private.
All right, let's talk about the criteria. We've talked a lot about the process. We're going to get into the timing in a second. Assuming, these contenders or several of them get past the community advisory committee where they need 2/3, 4 out of 6 votes just to sort of advance on to the New York City Gaming Location Facility Board. What are going to be the important factors, the important criteria that lead this board to choose 3 casinos? What are they going to be focusing on? What do they have to focus on under the statute? And just sort of, in your view, which ones are going to be priorities? What are they looking for? Is it just revenue generation? Is it speed to market?
Yeah. So look, I mean, there's 8 or 9 things that are mentioned as evaluation criteria. In fact, when you get into there's 8 or 9 sub points in each of like 4 or 5 different major points when you talk about the criteria to be evaluated on. Obviously, the biggest questions are going to be: is there local engagement? Is there a mitigation of local impacts? That's something that's just going to have to be a threshold question, where if you're not able to get through that, you're just going to run into trouble with the community advisory committee or what have you. But beyond that, look, the state's going to be looking to maximize revenue. First and foremost, we've got about $15 billion in out-year deficits in the state's multi-year financial plan. This year's pretty good, but the deficits start stacking up. So the state's going to be looking for a lot of money. The governor would like to take casino revenue, use it to fund shortfalls in the MTA, which is the New York City metropolitan area's transit agency. It's the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. They're going to want to maximize the number of jobs. So New York's, as I said, big union town. The hotel workers are certainly going to be heavily engaged on this, ensuring that the plans have the greatest number of good union jobs associated with it. And then, look, New York's a very diverse state, and we take pride in our diversity. So beyond money and jobs, they're going to be talking about what sort of captures the diversity best in New York and what celebrates the diversity of New York, because that's stuff that New Yorkers take seriously for a reason.
Okay. When is a decision going to be made? Where this broadcast or podcast will be released March 30th. Is this going to be made? Is this decision going to be made in calendar 2023? Describe the next couple of steps. When ultimately is this going to lead to a decision? When can we expect something?
So I'm going to just very directly duck your question. And the reason for that is, if I could predict the future, I'd probably be shorting stocks as opposed to working in politics and government for the last 30 years. They'd like to get it done in this fiscal year. So the state's fiscal year starts April 1st, runs through March 31st. The goal is to get a decision made and have payments start to flow in the current not the current fiscal year, but the one that starts next week. Can they execute on that?
All right.
Hopefully.
Well, I'd like to have you back to the extent you're
anytime.
able to participate, to talk about the process as it's underway, because right now we're in a sort of a slow period, but the activity is going to start to pick up very soon. And we're going to have these contentious public and community advisory committee meetings. We're going to have applicants. We're going to learn a lot more about the process over the next 2 to 3 months. So I'd love to have you back to come back on to talk about the progress of the New York City casino siting process. I want to leave you with 2 last questions. Last week, I mean, I follow gaming legislation throughout New York, and there was a very interesting resolution coming out of the New York State Assembly. Sports betting has been the province of the 4 upstate casinos, soon maybe the 7 overall casinos. Horse racing has always been sort of subservient to the casino industry when it comes to sports betting, but Assemblyman David Weprin introduced a concurrent resolution that would amend the New York State Constitution to allow horse race tracks off-track betting sites to participate in sports wagering to the same extent as the casinos. Is that a resolution or a proposal that we should take seriously at this point? Is it something that has a chance? And if so, how could that impact or potentially impact the New York gaming landscape?
So New York has, as I said, a lot of bills introduced. There's 20,000 bills introduced over the course of a 2-year session, more than any other state in the country. And there's no functional limits on how many bills each member can introduce. Assemblyman Weprin's a very good, a very good, smart, effective legislator, and is a dear friend who was actually at my wedding. And our fathers served together in the state legislature, and I ran his first campaigns for city council and state assembly. That being said, he's the chair of the insurance committee, and this would be the province of the racing and wagering committee. And I don't believe that Assemblyman Pretlow, J. Gary Pretlow, who chairs racing and wagering, is a co-sponsor of this bill. And frequently, if you want to advance gaming policy, you'd probably have Assemblyman Pretlow in the Assembly or Senator Dabo in the Senate as the sponsors.
I don't think they would like it very much if someone else introduced a bill, not only without their support, but perhaps without their knowledge. Probably not a good way to ensure victory.
I mean, look, they're collegial, and you know, and Assemblymember Weprin is again, his late father was Speaker of the Assembly. His brother was a member of the Assembly and City Council as well. He's friends with a lot of folks. Ultimately, the state is generating $900 million in its first year. Obviously, there's long-term questions about the viability of the tax revenue just because of the high rate of taxes. But the state decided to directly award licenses. It didn't even award licenses to the brick and mortar casinos. I think it's probably a very heavy lift for this bill to become, or for this resolution to move forward. And remember, if you're going to amend the state constitution, it would have to pass this year. Then there would have to be an election of the state legislature. Then they'd have to pass it again. And then the voters would have to vote for it. It just seems like it doesn't seem like a very high percentage shot.
All right. Well, let's talk about something with maybe a slightly higher percentage chance of happening every year since Governor Cuomo introduced this, or at least rammed through this, you know, sort of competitive bidding framework for New York online sports betting. There's been talk about changing the tax rate, maybe lowering it, increasing the number of operators, perhaps folding in, you know, New York professional sports venues. Where do you see online sports betting eventually settling in New York in terms of tax rate, system, number of operators? Because until there is change, there's going to be debate over this tax rate for time immemorial. Where do you see things eventually shaking out?
So again, not speaking on behalf of my clients, but just, you know, we're observing where I think Albany is on this. I think the key thing to consider here is that, yes, there's long-term sustainability concerns about the tax rate, but there's also no diversity in the marketplace. And as I said earlier, New York is a state that prides itself on diversity. And in the approval process, no applicants that had equity participation by people of color won mobile sports betting licenses. So the other thing to consider is that mobile sports betting as a separate market is sort of a fiction. If you go to a casino, yeah, there's a sports book, but it's part of the casino. So ultimately, mobile sports betting, iGaming, that's probably a market that moves forward. And the growth of that market will probably deal with things such as diversity in the marketplace, sustainable tax rates, ensuring that there's good union jobs in the mobile space as well as the brick and mortar space. There's some solutions to try to address all stakeholder considerations moving forward. And that's probably the cleanest path to deal with everything. In the short term, I think, yeah, there's some very immediate challenges that need to be dealt with for diversity in the marketplace, speed to market on certain wagers, the tax rate has to be sustainable, et cetera, et cetera.
No. Listen, Evan, this has been sort of this, journey through New York state gaming policy. I could keep you on for another couple of hours, but I promised I'd limit you to an hour. You have another appointment of the clients, New York state budget is coming down this week. It's a very critical week in your practice. Thank you for joining Conduct Detrimental. And everybody, this is Evan Stavisky, the founding partner and president of the Parkside Group, one of the essential, plugged in, wired political operators, lobbyists, government affairs people in the entire state of New York. So I want to have you back on, but thanks for sharing your insights and joining me on Conduct Detrimental. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I learned a lot during this interview and conversation. So I appreciate it, and I'm sure our audience will get a lot out of it as well. So thanks again, Evan.
My pleasure. Great to see you, and happy to come back anytime. Be well.